A single passport photo from 1965 shows a young woman walking down a bustling cobble street in a knee-length skirt, carrying physics textbooks. Today, that same street requires her complete physical erasure under penalty of law, while the national economy beneath her feet has contracted by 30%. We look at broken societies and assume they began that way. Spreadsheets from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund reveal a far more unsettling reality. These places did not start broken. They became broken through a precise, repeatable sequence of structural decisions. 7 distinct nations across 2 continents shared almost nothing in common. Different histories, different colonial legacies, and different economic foundations. Yet they are all arriving at the exact same destination: hyperinflation, systemic brain drain, and a permanent internal conflict that dissolves the functions of the state. In the 1960s, Beirut operated as the undisputed financial capital of the Middle East, a multi-confessional banking hub where global capital sought safety. Pre-revolutionary Iran possessed a rapidly expanding middle class, exporting highly trained engineers and medical doctors to Europe and the United States as peers rather than refugees. Libya maintained the highest per capita wealth in Africa, while Yemen, historically recorded as Arabia Felix, or Happy Arabia, drew international travelers to its unique architectural trade centers. None of these systems carried a structural flaw that guaranteed failure. A single, specific variable entered the equation: the ascension of a radical political religious framework that systematically targeted the state from within. This framework is not a religion or a broad civilization, but a highly organized administrative and military architecture. It operates by capturing either the state apparatus or the street, then rewriting the rules of societal survival. Once this mechanism gains traction, the society begins to liquefy according to a predictable timeline. The scientists flee, the banks freeze, women vanish from public life, and the state loses its defining characteristic: the monopoly on legitimate force. Consider the precise mechanics of the Lebanese collapse. By the mid-1970s, an armed parallel structure began consolidating within the country's borders, eventually naming itself Hezbollah. Funded directly by Tehran, this organization constructed a comprehensive state within a state, managing its own standing military, independent financial networks, and autonomous foreign policy. This parallel architecture broke the actual Lebanese government's monopoly on force. When a state loses its monopoly on violence, it loses its ability to enforce its laws. The domino effect moves with mathematical certainty. No enforcement means the immediate collapse of tax collection. Without tax revenue, the state cannot maintain public services or infrastructure. The disappearance of public services destroys civic trust, and the erasure of trust instantly implodes the banking sector. Today, the Lebanese pound has shed over 98% of its value against the dollar. Real GDP has shrunk by 45%, pushing the national poverty rate from 25% to 74%. Citizens now routinely hold up their own banks at gunpoint just to withdraw their life savings. While the banking sector sits on a dead weight of $72 billion in unrecoverable losses. While Lebanon demonstrates what happens when a parallel structure compromises a fraction of the state, Iran illustrates the consequences when that structure completely becomes the state. Before 1979, the University of Tehran served as an intellectual powerhouse for the region, producing engineers for OPEC and medical specialists for the global market. The Islamic Revolution aggressively inverted this hierarchy, placing theological compliance above technical expertise. The new leadership explicitly dismissed educated professionals as decayed brains, inviting them to exit the country if they opposed the ideological shift. The technical elite accepted the invitation in numbers that permanently altered the nation's trajectory. Prior to the revolution, approximately 500,000 Iranian-born individuals lived abroad. Today, that figure stands at 3.1 million. A recent Stanford University study tracked nearly 700,000 highly educated Iranians who fled specifically to pursue research overseas, effectively relocating one-third of the nation's entire research workforce. The regime's own internal metrics value this annual loss of human capital at $150 billion, a sum that regularly surpassed the state's total annual oil revenues. To sustain the ideological apparatus, the state systematically starved its own intellectual infrastructure, while the higher education budget received a nominal 13% increase amidst 40% inflation. The budget for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps surged by 200%. This systematic replacement of expertise with dogmatic loyalty reaches its absolute extreme in Afghanistan. During the mid-20th century, Kabul maintained one of the most progressive educational systems in Central Asia, training female radiologists, judges, and professors. The return of the Taliban in 2021 transformed the country into the only nation on earth that legally outlaws female education beyond the 6th grade. This single policy decision has instantly excluded 1.5 million girls from secondary schools. The UN estimates this structural removal of half the potential workforce costs the Afghan economy 2.5% of its GDP every single year, compounding indefinitely into the future. The erasure of human capital accelerated into direct structural paralysis. The regime terminated all remaining female civil servants, cutting off even the nominal stipends that sustained households. In late 2024, the state banned women from pursuing medical education, resulting in consecutive graduation cycles without a single female medical student. In a society where deep cultural edicts forbid male doctors from treating female patients, this policy effectively programs the total collapse of the healthcare system for half the population. The domestic economy has contracted by nearly 30%, leaving 45% of the population dependent on international humanitarian aid to survive. The structural blueprint for this entire global phenomenon did not originate in Kabul or Beirut. It was engineered during the Algerian Civil War of the 1990s. The armed factions introduced a concept known as takfir, the formal declaration of fellow Muslims as apostates if they failed to support the radical political agenda. This administrative designation stripped away all moral restraints on violence, rendering journalists, educators, and civil servants legitimate targets for execution. Over 200,000 people died in the resulting conflict, inflicting $20 billion in material damage and permanently freezing the nation's political evolution. The takfir mechanism proved so operationally efficient that it did not remain confined within Algerian borders. It mutated into a highly exportable doctrinal engine, quietly spreading across national frontiers to prepare the ground for a much wider systemic contagion. In Yemen, the mechanism weaponized monetary policy to split a nation's economic spinal cord. When the Houthi movement captured Sana'a, they did not just occupy government ministries. They seized the financial regulatory architecture. By establishing a rival central bank, they fractured a single economic zone into two warring financial structures. In July 2025, the Houthi administration attempted to solve its internal liquidity crisis by printing its own independent variant of the currency. This decision instantly killed any remaining monetary unity, causing the domestic market to split along geographic front lines. To fund this parallel governance, the group systematically extorted local enterprises, seized international food shipments, and hijacked humanitarian distribution lines. By early 2026, they detained 73 United Nations personnel to neutralize external oversight. When an administrative structure values missile procurement over basic municipal plumbing, biological failure follows. Cholera and severe acute malnutrition become structural features of the geography. The 2026 United Nations Humanitarian Response Plan tracks 22 million people, half the population, requiring immediate aid to survive. This domestic devastation does not remain localized. By launching drone and missile strikes into the Bab al-Mandab Strait, a domestic militant group effectively altered global maritime geography. Container ships fled the Red Sea, rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks of delay and billions in operational costs to international trade. The regional parasite successfully converted itself into a global economic tax. Libya exposes the myth that natural resource wealth provides immunity against this structural decay. Following the collapse of the central regime in 2011, Western analysts assumed that an oil revenue stream could automatically finance a democratic transition. Instead, the sudden vacuum pulled in hundreds of autonomous Islamist militias. These factions did not disarm. They integrated into the state's payroll, rebranding themselves as official security forces while retaining their factional loyalties. They quietly assumed control over security agencies, public corporations, and direct cash transfers from the Central Bank of Libya. The state attempted to stabilize itself through the 2013 Political Isolation Law. This legislative act aimed to purge the bureaucracy of old regime elements, but it functioned as an administrative suicide note. It disqualified the country's entire technocratic class, instantly handing banks, ministries, and state enterprises to whoever possessed the physical firepower to occupy the buildings. Militia commanders became de facto kings. The nation fractured into competing regimes. The internationally recognized government in the West and Khalifa Haftar's forces in the East, backed by Russia and the UAE. In the chaos, ISIS seized the city of Sirte, while foreign mercenaries flooded the oil fields. Between 2011 and 2021, this systemic plunder drained 783 billion Libyan dinars, roughly $160 billion, in lost economic potential for a population of just 7 million people. The state mutated into a commercial terminal for human trafficking and weapon smuggling, exporting instability directly into the Sahel region to fuel insurgencies in Mali and Burkina Faso. The final stage of this mechanism achieves permanence when the radical structure stops trying to govern and shifts to preventing governance altogether. In Somalia, Al-Shabaab has sustained a failed state reality for 35 consecutive years by turning chaos into an institutional strategy. The group controls 30% of the nation's territory, making it more operationally active and wealthier than the internationally backed federal government. During the 2022 government counteroffensive, the military attempted to reclaim territory using local clan alliances. Al-Shabaab responded in February 2025 with the Chabal offensive, systematically retaking the Zagzag because the formal state lacked the structural mass to hold them. By July 2025, militant forces advanced within 50 kilometers of Mogadishu. The group operates with total structural immunity inside the capital. In March 2025, they nearly assassinated the Somali president with a remote IED, and in October 2025, a coordinated suicide squad infiltrated the National Intelligence and Security Agency headquarters just 1 kilometer from the presidential palace, erasing critical files and liberating high-value detainees. The Somali National Army has sustained up to 15,000 casualties in 3 years because it fights an enemy that views stabilization as a theological sin. Operating with over 900 documented cases of child soldier recruitment, the group runs rival Sharia courts and taxes territories outside its military control. Every time the government attempts to pour concrete for a school, a clinic, or a paved road, Al-Shabaab destroys it. The strategy does not seek to conquer the ruins. It seeks to ensure the ruins remain permanent. By entering the midpoint of 2026, the entire seven-nation matrix has passed the point of structural return. The emergency measures deployed by these collapsing regimes no longer stabilize the system. They accelerate its descent. In January 2026, following the devastating infrastructure strikes of the 12-day war and the subsequent elimination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, The Central Bank of Iran printed a 10 million rial banknote to keep pace with a 105% food inflation rate. This single slip of paper, worth a mere $7 on the street, signals the mathematical death of the national currency as real GDP contracts by over 6%. In March 2026, under immense international pressure, the Lebanese government issued a formal decree banning Hezbollah's military operations on paper. The systemic irrelevance of that paper became clear the exact same week, when the group launched waves of retaliatory rockets across the border, completely ignoring the sovereign state's executive command. Meanwhile, the judiciary remains paralyzed. The Beirut port explosion investigation sits entirely frozen 5.5 years later, blocked by the very factions that occupy the parliament. In Kabul, the permanent exclusion of women from universities has systematically dried up the pipeline of female medical professionals, matching a penal code that now legally permits domestic violence. The administrative apparatuses of these nations have ceased to function as instruments of development. They have become containment vessels for human misery. The kinetic pressure inside these broken systems has crossed the structural threshold. The facade of sovereignty remains upright, but the internal columns have already turned to ash, leaving nothing to stop the imminent kinetic collapse. The map of the modern Middle East and North Africa no longer represents a collection of sovereign states. It represents a series of containment zones. By mid-2026, the international community has exhausted its conventional diplomatic toolkit, relying on delayed, purely decorative interventions that fail to engage with the structural reality on the ground. The International Monetary Fund offers multi-billion-dollar stabilization packages contingent on fiscal reforms. Yet these demands are addressed to central banks that no longer control their domestic money supply. UN mandates deploy peacekeepers to enforce lines of separation that parallel militias cross at will. These institutions treat a terminal systemic mutation as if it were a temporary macroeconomic downturn. The administrative machinery required to implement a recovery has been completely liquidated from within. The primary cost of this institutional paralysis falls entirely on the remaining demographic base. The flight of the professional class has progressed from an acute brain drain to an absolute demographic truncation. When a society expels its engineers, judges, and doctors, it does not merely lose labor, it loses its institutional memory. In Beirut, Tehran, and Kabul, the urban middle class has ceased to exist as an economic category. The population divides cleanly into a microscopic elite that profits directly from the war economy and a vast, disenfranchised majority surviving on irregular foreign remittances or primitive black market barter. Generational wealth accumulated over a century of commercial activity vanished in less than a decade of hyperinflation. What remains is a landscape of human exhaustion, where survival requires complete submission to the local armed faction controlling the distribution of water, bread, and fuel. While the legitimate economy contracts into nothingness, a highly efficient, parallel war economy expands to exploit the vacuum. The real beneficiaries of this collapse are not vague political entities, but highly organized cross-border cartels and opportunistic foreign empires. In the Levant, the production and export of synthetic narcotics like Captagon has transformed into a multi-billion-dollar state-backed enterprise, generating the hard currency required to sustain militant networks, despite Western sanctions. In Libya, human trafficking networks have institutionalized their operations, converting the migration corridor into a predictable revenue stream that funds rival militias and bribes maritime officials. External actors, specifically Russia's expeditionary forces and regional asymmetric networks, systematically harvest the remaining industrial assets, mineral deposits, and port facilities of these broken territories. The forces that thrive in these environments have a vested financial interest in ensuring the state never reconstitutes itself. Chaos is no longer an accidental byproduct of war. It is a highly profitable corporate strategy. This structural decay is now actively spilling over its original borders, creating a clear risk of regional contagion. Neighboring states that previously maintained a fragile internal equilibrium are fracturing under the sheer weight of the surrounding collapse. Jordan faces severe economic and security pressure as illicit smuggling networks weaponize its northern and eastern frontiers, destabilizing its domestic security apparatus. Egypt remains caught in a vice between a permanently disrupted Red Sea transit corridor and the destabilizing pressure of the collapsing Libyan and Sudanese borders. Across the Sahel, the collapse of Libyan authority has turned the entire geographic belt into a continuous laboratory for stateless violence, where radical insurgencies dismantle fragile civilian administrations with geometric predictability. The mechanism does not respect national boundaries. It treats every adjacent, functioning society as the next viable host. The global economy is now paying a permanent structural tax to accommodate this decentralized instability. The diversion of maritime traffic away from the Suez Canal and around the Cape of Good Hope is no longer a temporary emergency detour. By the summer of 2026, international shipping conglomerates have permanently integrated this longer, costlier route into their multi-year logistics budgets, structurally raising the cost of manufactured goods and energy across Europe and Asia. The weaponization of strategic geographic choke points by non-state actors has effectively rewritten the laws of global commerce. A radical asymmetric movement operating from the ruins of a failed state now possesses the structural leverage to alter the inflation rates of G7 industrial economies. The international system is forced to expend billions in naval deployment costs just to protect basic trade routes from low-cost drone technology. An asymmetric equation that favors the parasite over the host. This data leads to a singular, definitive conclusion. The process of systemic collapse within these 7 nations is structurally irreversible. The conventional narrative of post-conflict reconstruction relies on a fundamental fallacy: the assumption that a broken society retains the internal building blocks necessary to rebuild. Once the foundational elements of civic life, institutional trust, technical expertise, uniform law enforcement, and physical safety have been completely dissolved, they cannot be reassembled through foreign aid or international treaties. The attempts to engineer a recovery resemble an effort to rebuild a shattered glass vessel using the energy that broke it. The 7 distinct historical experiments have concluded, and the results are uniform. The mechanism has successfully